but about the patriot leaders trying to use these stories in terms of mobilization, not so much. So and the other thing that I also learned from these newspapers was I was reading the same thing over and over again. Over and over and over again. I was reading the same story in the same words, the same language. And I began to think, well, that's super weird. What's going on here? If I could have the next slide, please. What I was also beginning to understand is how much these guys, and they're mostly men, are understanding the power of the press and how to propagate, to get these stories out into the public. And so this is taken from John Adams's diary in 1769, when he looks much closer to this picture as opposed to an old man. I love this one too, because he's kind of giving you a little bit of the side eye in this picture, like something might not totally be up in this. I love it, because what he's saying in his diary is the evening is spent preparing for the next day's newspapers, a curious employment, cooking up paragraphs, articles, occurrences, working the political engine. What Adams is referring to in this diary is he and his cousin Sam and James Otis were in the offices of the Boston Gazette, working with Benjamin Eads and John Gill, the printers, making stuff up, what we might today call fake news, about all sorts of...
Rob, can you hold on just one moment? We're just going to start. We lost the audio feed for a moment.
Okay.
So can you just, I'm sorry. Can you just back up a few minutes, maybe back to where you started talking? Actually, I'll back you up a couple minutes to seeing the same stories repeatedly in the papers.
Okay. I'm going to take this opportunity to do not disturb myself. Okay. So back to, is that okay?
I think so.
Okay. All right. So one of the things that I was seeing is I was seeing in the newspapers the same story over and over and over again, in the same words and the same sentences, same articles. And I began to think about what that meant for sort of this movement of trying to get people to overcome all of their problems, all of the things that were going on. And I also began to sort of understand how involved the John Adamses and Ben Franklins and Thomas Jeffersons and George Washingtons of the world were in putting these news feeds of peoples together. And so this is from a diary that John Adams' diary from 1769, and it says and this is a picture of John Adams closer to when he is the age of which he writes this in 1769. He says in his diary, "The evening was spent in preparing for the next day's newspaper, a curious employment, cooking up paragraphs, articles, occurrences, and working the political engine," which suggests that he's in some ways manipulating the news. Adams writes this on a Sunday night, and the next day's newspaper, the September 4th edition that comes out on Monday, is full of things that may or may not be true. And John Adams is there with his cousin Sam Adams and James Otis and the two Boston Gazette printers, and they're putting things together that may or may not be exactly what the news is. And so you're seeing a lot of kind of editorial management going on to what people are doing. And the things that are in this Boston Gazette newspaper that comes out on September 4th would then just be reprinted in other places. What the parlance of the term then was called the exchanges. There were no reporters or journalists at this time, so the bulk of the news that new people are seeing in the newspapers, and there are about 36 newspapers in most of the port cities of America at this point. They get the bulk of their news from one another. That's called the exchanges. And so the things that the Adams cousins are putting in the newspaper in Boston could then be repeated in Philadelphia or Annapolis or Williamsburg. And you might not know if it's true or not true. And so I began to think about what's going on here and how this could be something that enables the clocks to work together. Enables the clocks to work together. For me also, I wanted to think especially about the war itself. Can I have the next slide, please? The war as its own thing. In that same letter to Jefferson, that he talks about, what do we mean by the revolution? Where do we find the answers for it? It's in the newspapers and things. He says, what do we mean by the revolution? The war, that's no part of the revolution. It's only an effect or a consequence of it. The revolution was in the minds of the people, and this was affected from 1760 to 1775. So Adams says the miracle that happens of bringing the 13 clocks together happens before the shooting starts. And this, I think, is not entirely true or the case. It's kind of this John Adams side-eyeing us, cooking up paragraphs, John Adams, as opposed to the old guy on the left. There's a lot more going on here to make these clocks strike together than he would like to admit. It's not a kind of an organic process. There's a lot of management. There's a lot of cooking up that has to do. Can I have one more slide, please? We don't think of the war being really super important because historians have been trained by books like this very, very, very famous book that's now 50 years old, called The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution, probably the most important book, I would say, written last half of the 20th century, Serena, I would think. And 2 chapters of this book are started with epigraphs that come exactly from this quote. What do we mean by the revolution? The war? The war had nothing to do with it. John Adams writes that to Jefferson in 1815, and he plagiarizes himself in 1818 when he writes it to Hezekiah Niles and says the exact same thing. So this book has taught us that the big bulk of the work happens before any bullets fly. And that's also what I want to look at is now that people's bodies are on the line and they have to, they really have to put their families and their futures at stake and might get killed for this. Does that raise the stakes? And I think it does. And so to my mind, we begin to see these things happening more and more and more. And I want to wrap this up really quickly by talking about some of the things that I'm seeing. Could I have the next slide, please? Here's what I'm seeing in these newspapers after the shooting starts that I wasn't seeing before in that time when what do we mean by the war? It had nothing to do with it. Stories like this. The Canadian Governor Guy Carlton and British Superintendent Guy Johnson is meeting with natives 1,500 miles back in Quebec to make them great offers to take up arms against the colonists. You're seeing that kind of story pop up and then be repeated and then over and over again. That would be in the New Hampshire Gazette, but then it would be also in Philadelphia newspapers and the Norfolk newspaper and the Williamsburg newspaper. The Norfolk printer actually turned it into 15,000 miles, which always cracks me up. And then the following week, another report saying that British Superintendent Guy Johnson is suspected of endeavoring to stir up the Indians against the colonies. And that's also in all of these newspapers too, but in New York and then in Connecticut and then in Boston and then in Salem and then again in New Hampshire. Next slide, please. And then we see stories like this one. This is one of my very favorite ones. This comes from a letter written by Philip Schuyler, he of the very famous Three Schuyler Sisters' Daughters from the musical. He writes a letter to the Continental Congress saying, the Indians delivered us a speech on the 12th in which they related the substance of all the conferences that Colonel Johnson had with them in the summer, of which they invited us to feast on a Bostonian and drink his blood. And that letter ends up at the Continental Congress, and they order it printed, and it's printed all over the place in Philadelphia and New York and Baltimore and Boston 3 times and Williamsburg, et cetera, et cetera. We're seeing those kind of things happening more and more and more, and they're being officially ordered to be printed, and so people are learning these things more and more and more. Can I have the next slide, please? In 1775, very famously, the Virginia Governor Lord Dunmore offers freedom to any able-bodied male slaves who are the slaves of patriots who can make it to his lines. We think about 1,000 do, but that also then becomes this really big sort of propaganda moment where you're seeing stories of those things go over and over and over and over again. This is what I think is the thing that John Adams doesn't want us to think about, but is so much more about on people's timelines in 1775 and 76, which is what this book is all about. Could I have the next slide, please? and I'll finish with this. We can talk about the Declaration because it's very much in the Declaration, but this is one of the people who becomes a victim of this. A British official says the newspapers were full of publications calculated or cooked up to excite the fears of the people. Massacres and instigated insurrections were in the mouths of words in the mouths of every child. And that was what I found so much in these newspapers and in what people are talking about at the time. And I think we've underestimated how much patriot leaders embraced and used stories about race, about the potential of slave insurrections and the potential of native hostility as a way to get these clocks to strike together, which is more than I wanted to say, but I think that probably sums up most of the book. What do you think, Serena?
Thank you. Yes, I think that was a really helpful sort of overview of the book. And I wonder now if I could ask you to dig into two pieces of what you said that will maybe explain a little more to the to our audience your subtitle. So the book is called 13 Clocks: How Race United the Colonies, that's part one, and two, made the Declaration of Independence. So that last part you only sort of waved at, so we're going to get there. You talked to us first largely about the newspapers. So here I want to ask you a question that maybe I'll read as a little naive, but I think is worth asking, right? Which is, you talked about how you read these newspapers and you saw lots about slave insurrections and native conflicts on the frontier, and that surprised you. But I'm wondering, why don't you think that there were just a lot of insurrections and native conflicts? Why don't you think that the newspapers were actually just reporting the news? So maybe you can start with explaining that to us. I think that will help us see the first part of your subtitle.
Sure. When the news of this crazy thing, right, civil war in the empire, which has never happened before, sort of comes out of Massachusetts, that there's going to be shooting now, this imperial crisis has reached this whole new level. Everybody, in many ways, has to make a calculation about how this is going to affect their lives. Men and women all over North America are going to have to think about this. And this is exactly what, I mean, patriot leaders want people to pick their side. When they say this is what liberty means, you should follow our side of this. Enslaved people are going to think themselves about what's going on here. This is an opportunity that has never really happened before. It certainly hadn't happened for many people in the 18th century. Not social disturbances of this magnitude, and it's going to shift many calculi on all over sort of what we would refer to as the backcountry, all the way from Canada to Florida. There's going to be a new kind of dynamic going on here about the Civil War, and so people are thinking about what this means to them. There are some potential. There are some slave revolts that happen in North Carolina. There's rumors of some in South Carolina. There are some happening in Virginia even before Dunmore's proclamation. But for the most part, there isn't a little bit surprising. There's not a massive rising, and what's really ironic is Jefferson and the Declaration refers to the merciless Indian savages very famously in the Declaration. But until the Declaration, Native peoples had been merciful to the Americans for sure. There had been very, very little. Only in like the 4 weeks before the 4th of July was there any real actual hostility happening. But everybody was worried about all of it all the time. As soon if you trace the sort of story of Lexington and Concord down, especially as it gets into Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas, almost immediately the people in those places begin to think about what this means in terms of enslaved people. Oh my God! What do we do about gunpowder and enslaved people? That happens in Maryland. That happens in Virginia. That happens in South Carolina. So people begin to think about how this is going to affect the worlds that they live in. Those so there's some reality for sure, but there's also this kind of much bigger, I think, at that time, penumbra about fear about these things and rumor and what's going to happen, what might potentially happen, that kind of makes those things get bigger and bigger and bigger. And we see that in the Declaration. The 27th and final grievance of the Declaration is about domestic insurrections and merciless Indian savages. That's the Declaration's grievances to me they build in climax, they build in drama, they reach a point, and that's the very last one. That's the deal breaker, that the king has done this.
So okay. So what we're saying, if I'm recapping there correctly, is that yes, the upheavals that began really in the 1760s, right, as the French are leaving North America, and there's what historians call the imperial crisis, right, as the British Empire is trying to figure out, how do we make sense of now a much larger empire than we had before, right? We're going to do all kinds of things to organize and control it. That creates a number of conflicts with colonists, and that becomes the crisis. So as the crisis continues to heat up, right? The British government makes some choices. Colonists don't love them. They respond, right? And people become harder and harder edged, until finally we get to April 19th, 1775, when one sees the shooting of Minutemen, as we call them, right, in Lexington and Concord, which continues a set of other conflicts. So that you're saying, of course, we know Lexington and Concord really happened, right? Like people really did die there. But as that story keeps moving through the newspapers in something that looks a little bit like an AP news service, right? That's the exchanges you're talking about. They start to collect, to snowball, right? And pick up bigger and bigger bits of snow. And the bits that they pick up are not really stories about the particular Minutemen who die, or anything about like what actually maybe happened on Lexington Green. The stories that they pick up are really stories of this racial conflict. Yeah. Is that?
And they're also not, at this point, they're also then not talking about constitutions or consent, right? Or representation anymore, or taxes in any way. This is what the stories become to be about.
Yes. So that's really helpful. So then, because then in 76, right, a year later, we get in 15 months, when actually the Continental Congress meets and constructs the Declaration of Independence, they don't forget about that language of rights that were violated, but they also don't forget about these arguments about race that have been showing up in the newspapers, right? Yeah. So talk to us another minute about that last complaint.
The complaint about race?
Yes.
Yeah. So one of the things that so the R word, which is in the subtitle, right? How race unites the colonies. That's the only place in the book where I actually use that word, because it is a word that is very much under construction in the 18th century. And this is what I think in many ways is the magic formula that overcomes all these problems that Adams lays out in that 1818 letter, all these things that they don't have in common. When patriot leaders who are very desperate to try to find something that can stick people together, when they open the sort of cultural toolbox, what's laying right on top are these fears about our colonial attitudes that have grown up in the 17th and 18th century about enslaved people, killing them and their families, which stands to reason, and about native hostility that's really grown sort of the generation since the 1750s and 60s. They've been very much reminded. It goes way back, but very much reminded in the 7 Years' War and Pontiac's War about what that can look like, and that I think is what they embrace. Those things are unifiers for these colonies, that people, more than sort of slavery itself. If you agree or disagree with slavery, that's a different thing than this kind of racialized fear about the place of African Americans in colonial and then sort of United States society and the republic we're building about that. That's the kind of that's where I think these things really matter.
So I'm going to step back a minute, and I think eventually we'll come back to that question about what really matters, right? What work, in some ways, is this? Right. Are these stories doing? To something that you said at the beginning of your introduction when you held up for us the Common Cause at 750 pages, right? And so this book is sort of derived from it, but it's not the same book. So could you talk a little bit about what's different about this book from your 2016 book, and why you decided you needed to write something smaller, besides the fact that it's hard to ask undergraduates to read 750 pages in a term?
Well, right. So it's in many ways, the answer to that is having my cake and eating it too. And part of it also was but what I mean by that is writing something that people like you, Serena, my scholar colleagues would read and sort of think about how they think about the revolution, and then being able to write something that 19-year-olds would also not hate reading. So that's what I mean by having my cake and eating it too. But a core reason why the first book is so bloody long is because I wanted to sort of put out there how much of this stuff I was seeing. I wanted to kind of, I wanted to convey the heft of the archive. This is not just kind of a epiphenomenal thing. This is not. This is a central part of the revolutionary mobilization campaign, the Common Cause argument that we've really missed. That this is an important part of this, and these stories are what the two things that the American leadership don't have a lot of is time and money. So when what they spend their time and money on tells us how important it is to them. And they spend a lot of time and money on putting these stories together and getting them to the American people as much as they possibly can. Whenever there's a problem, when the war goes terribly badly, they always go back to these stories. They write proclamations that feature them. They put them in addresses. They go back to these over and over and over again. So I wanted to sort of convey that. And throughout the entire revolution. But the 13 clocks part is something we don't really do this anymore. We used to do this as a profession much better than we do now, which is to abridge big, thick, scholarly books and make it much more accessible. We used to do that. When I was thinking about this, I went back and looked at Gary Nash's Urban Crucible and so-called fat phoner and thin phoner, right? The Eric Foner's, reconstruction and then a short history of it. Even Ed Ayers' Promise of the New South, he made it a Winthrop Jordan's White Over Black. There are thinner, more focused, but much more sort of younger and more public-facing readers in mind for this. And I wanted to do that. I wanted to, again, have my cake and eat it too and present this. And so I decided just to focus on what I thought was the most important thing, the 15 months between the shooting starting at Lexington and Concord and the Declaration of Independence, and make that kind of the central part of this book and sort of distill the rest of it for everything else.
So let me first affirm that when I say that this is, a lovely book to teach, as you say, to 19-year-olds, I mean, one of the reasons that is so is because it's a book that one can read without a lot of guidance. So those of you who are watching or not actually in a class, you don't need, someone to help walk you through this book. And this, Rob, you do a beautiful job of kind of unpacking this central problem that I think I want to redefine or restate for you at least, and then ask a question that just spoke to me as you were talking, because the central problem for both you and for John Adams, which I just find so surprising, is how did 13 clocks, right? 13 different colonies come to strike as one. And so, you start with this, with Adams's own explanation for this, right? Which is that there are all of these different, every colony was so different. They didn't share anything together. And yet somehow through some miracle of God, practically, and maybe a little bit of help that maybe he's not going to be too clear about, that, these colonies come together. And you, I think, if I understand this book correctly, think, I'm not going to completely buy everything John Adams has to say to me here, right? I want to look a little deeper, but the problem he identifies is the right one. This question of how is it that colonies that were so disparate, that imagine themselves as having a relationship solely to the British Empire, not necessarily to each other, come to imagine themselves as a nation.
Right. And so that tells us two things. First of all, how fragile the Union is always. And again, it's going to fall apart and have to be reconstructed, right? So the Union always is an extraordinarily tenuous thing. And also but that's also an argument that is dear to my heart about contingency. That these reaching into that toolbox for these specific images is a contingent thing. And it's important to understand that while I agree that with people who talk about how deeply embedded race is to American society, structurally, we have to understand how it got there. And that's the contingent part of thinking about these very specific things about the newspapers. How is it that these things that seem to be these massive sort of cloud banks of attitudes, how do they get fastened to the ground? That's a big part of this.
So can you just for a moment define contingency as historians use that word?
Sure.
What do you say there?
Contingency means things didn't have to turn out the way they did. It's not inevitable that things had to be that way. And so we have to look at the specific time and place and look at the choices people made in the moment, why they did what they did.
So some 70 years ago, maybe there was a book, and not an excellent book, but on the Declaration of Independence, right? But with an excellent title called Miracle at Philadelphia, right? That sort of just implied that somehow the heavens opened and the Declaration dropped down, right? And your point is that's not the way in which the Declaration was constructed.
Not at all.
It wasn't the fight over the language.
No, and I mean, Jefferson only has a handful of, Jefferson, one of the things that I talk about in the sort of the construction of the Declaration is just how pressed for time he is, that while he's writing the Declaration, which he has about 3 weeks to do, he's also doing other things. He's the secretary of this investigation committee about this disaster that happens in Canada as the Canadian invasion falls apart, that's the first instance in which we begin to see natives acting with the British. Jefferson is involved in the investigation of what has happened and the potential court-martialing of American officers, and we have all those notes in his handwriting that's happening in the middle of June while he's supposed to be, off in his room writing this essay. He's doing these other things like our students are, right?
So, thinking about this, but for which you clearly have so much enthusiasm as I do, I mean, could you find a favorite part, or is that a little bit like talking about your favorite child? Is there a favorite part of this book? Or favorite story? Or something that really said to you, oh, now I know I've got this right?
Now I know I've got this right.
Or a favorite piece.
Well, a favorite story. Well, one of the things that, about contingency is about how, especially in 1775, we like to think that many of these dudes knew what they were doing all the time, and it just, they weren't fumbling around in the dark and just entirely, in many ways, desperate to try to understand what's going on in the world around them. Kind of like we are today. And so, but they're very, and so John Conley is a loyalist agent in Pittsburgh, and he's big pals with Lord Dunmore, the governor of Virginia, and he has a plan. He's going to rouse the Shawnee and Delaware and Mingo Indians in sort of western Pennsylvania, what's now eastern Ohio, and he's going to get them to fight for the crown, and Dunmore's going to free enslaved people, and they're going to meet together at Washington's house at Mount Vernon. They're going to cut the revolution in half, and they're going to meet, and they're going to sort of have a sort of big party on the lawn at Mount Vernon. That's the plan. Conley goes to Dunmore. Dunmore says, "Sure, I don't care. It doesn't cost me anything." And he sends Conley up to General Gage in Boston. And General Gage in November of 1775 says, "Okay, doesn't cost me anything. Knock yourself out, dude." John Conley's servant is an Englishman named William Cowley, freaks out about this and runs away and sneaks his way when Conley's on his way back and he's going to go to Detroit and get people, and this is what's going to happen. He sneaks away and he runs ashore in Newport, Rhode Island, and he makes his way to Washington's headquarters, where he sort of knocks on the tent, I guess, and says, "Dude, I got news for you." Right? This happens like 4 days after the Continental Army's Surgeon General Benjamin Church has been found out to be a traitor, and they just finished that trial, and then all of a sudden there's a knocking on the tent. Oh my God! And so Washington stays up all night writing letters to the Continental Congress. Oh crap! We got all this. That's the way 1775 is. It's this constant just roiling of concern about plots and what's true and what's not true, and insurrections here and rebellions there, potential ones. It's bananas. I think it's so much fun, but it certainly wasn't for them at the time.
Yes, it's a lot going on at once, right? Feels like things are coming at Washington all the time.
All
right?
the time.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
And so he's trying to organize it. Is he trying to organize these politics in the same way that somebody like Adams or Jefferson, who really aren't in the front line at all, are trying to organize it? Is that also part of his story?
It is. And one of the I'll give you a very small thing that's actually in the big common cause that's not in 13 Clocks, but Trenton, Christmas 1776. George Washington spends 2.5 weeks organizing all of the logistics for Trenton, right? Trying to keep it secret, wagons, boats, food, trying to get people to be there. In the papers of George Washington, I think it's 200 pages consecutively that Washington is concerned about just trying to get this thing to get pulled off. The night before the Trenton raid, there is a letter to the St. John's and Passamaquoddy Indians that Washington writes, who are native peoples in Maine, telling them, stay out of this. This is a fight between us and the British. Oh, either join us or stay out of this, but please don't join them. And I was like, look at this. Like, the night before, it's like Eisenhower writing the night before D-Day about something else, and you're like, wait a minute, what? Why are you doing this night? Like, you've been working on this for months. But that just shows you how much that's still on his mind, that he's writing a kind of an ambassador's letter. Hey, for them. That's the kind of work that Adams and Jefferson and Franklin do a lot more than Washington, but he does it too.
So you there have sort of anticipated my question about what is it that, didn't quite make it from your 2016 book into this 2021 book, right? These important other stories. But I'm wondering then from 13 Clocks, which, as you said, of course, is meant to be slim, but if there are nonetheless some threads in there that you would like to continue to play out moving forward, things that you would like, oh, there's still more to be said about this particular part.
I do think there's more to be said about. I struggled in both books about where to put loyalists. Loyalist is a very difficult. I think it's a very difficult thing to get your hands on, and oftentimes when the patriots are trying to really get people's attention about loyalists, they almost always put them in groups with, or in events with, or in league with Native peoples and enslaved peoples. They'll always talk about, well, a group of Tories and blacks did this, or a group of Indians and Tories do this. They're trying their best to connect those things together, but it's super difficult to do that. Getting your handle on that, I think, is also something else. Now, I also think that the inability to do that, to sort of fasten these things together, the slipperiness of that, makes it possible to do this other really weird thing that I also don't think we've gotten a super good handle on. A lot of historians have tried really hard to understand how easily Americans reintegrate loyalists into American society. There isn't a purge. There isn't any kind of, there's a little bit, but it's really kind of,
there's no guillotine.
Sort of letting bygones be bygones. It doesn't make sense to me. I don't feel like anybody's really nailed it yet. There's some good work on that, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's just a mystery that has no solution to it. I don't know. But that to me seems like something else that I would like to try to keep working on myself.
I think that's a really interesting point that loops back to something that you started with, which is that at least in 1775, 1776, this feels like a civil war. Yeah. Right? That there are people who, I don't know, to you, does it feel like the U.S. Civil War, brother against brother? Like, in what way does it feel like a civil war to you that then opened up this problem of loyalists?
It does. I mean, it's very, and it's also very, very hard feelings, right? There's a lot of things that we should think in terms of temper tantrums, or because it's really hard feelings of betrayal. That the king has done these. I mean, the king has done these terrible things to us. I mean, Jefferson's the rough draft of the Declaration, and anybody who hasn't read the rough draft, you should read the rough draft about, especially the bit that gets cut out. We could talk about that too. About if you just looking at the editing process of the Declaration on the 2nd and 3rd of July, where does the Congress spend their time really getting this right? The bulk of the beginning of the Declaration, the first 2 paragraphs, the preamble that everybody knows, the first 20 or so grievances are just very lightly edited. Where the bulk of all of the you see this on the thing. All that text that you see there is with a few minor, instead of inalienable, it's unalienable. Like, they just make the changes. But when we get down to the bottom, if you take the next slide, can I have the next slide? There we go. The bottom, where I've circled it in blue, is the last one, that deal breaker that says he has excited domestic insurrectionists and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages. That's not how that actually first was written. Jefferson had a long paragraph about an impassioned, beautiful paragraph about how awful and terrible the African slave trade is. In capital letters, underlined things. He's shouting at us, as we know from texting parlance, in these capital letters, things, calling it an assemblage of horrors, calling it piratical warfare, calling it all these terrible things. And at the end of that paragraph, he says, and then it's this horrible thing. And then the king is now inciting domestic insurrectionists against us, using these same people to murder us, that they shouldn't have been here in the first place. And the Congress takes all the beginning part out and keeps that other part. they take out the anti-slavery part and they keep the Dunmore's Proclamation part, and then attaches it to this last one. That's what's in there. And I think about, if we think about abolitionists in the 1850s, like Wendell Phillips or Frederick Douglass, what they would have done with that language, they do remarkable things with the Declaration. They really radicalized in some ways the Declaration. But if that would have been in there still, oh man, that would have been just so tremendous to keep. But I think it goes away, right? Because that's threatening the Union, right? Anti-slavery, ooh, that's a little controversial. Dunmore, no, that's not controversial.
So I think we have time maybe for 2 more questions.
Okay.
So I'll limit myself. So the first one, since you so kindly highlighted it here, just, opens up for me that final phrase, right? Where they're talking about destruction of people of all ages, sexes, and conditions. And the story that you've been telling us so far is a story of Adams and Jefferson and Washington, sort of our big guy founders,
Right.
do important, indeed essential things for your story, quite rightly. But I'm wondering, is there a place for these other people, children, women, right?
Right.
Actually, people who are enslaved, as we talk about conditions? I think that means conditions of servitude. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is a book that's, to me, these stories about race really sort of jumped out at me as I was reading these things. And the patriot leaders are being very explicit about them. They're being less explicit and more implicit, I think, about things like protecting families, about masculinity and femininity. Those things are what we would consider today questions about gender. Those things are very there, but they're almost sort of assumed. Like this, you're going to take action to defeat enslaved people, to protect your families from these things, and they don't make that point as explicitly or as propagandally. Although sometimes they do. There's a lot of stories about one of the things that's also in 13 Clocks is about the Hessians, the German mercenaries that come, and about how immediately they're also seen as another, which is also in the Declaration here about foreign mercenaries. They're seen as this other threat, but immediately they go away and they're not seen as that anymore. One of the reasons they're seen as a threat is because they are raping women in New Jersey. And that is something that the Patriot leaders talk a lot about. As Washington is getting all this stuff for Trenton, he's really trying to get that message out there. You got to defend families from these things. And another story that's also in Common Cause is also about, and in 13 Clocks, is about Jane McCrae. There are three things that I found that were in every single newspaper in America. 3 stories: Lexington and Concord, Declaration of Independence, Jane McCrae. Jane McCrae is a loyalist woman who is allegedly killed by natives who are allied to John Burgoyne in the Saratoga campaign in 1777. And she's in New York, and she's killed, and she may or may not have been in her wedding dress when she was killed. And the fact that they kill a woman who was engaged to a loyalist and maybe one herself just shows you the depravity of the British and their natives for doing these terrible things. Using her story is so important because it's both gender and race tied together. So there's a lot of that. I haven't focused out that part of it in the story, but because there's a lot of it's implicit, but I think it's very much there.
So and I think in our final 5 minutes, maybe you could talk a moment about the resonances of your book for the contemporary moment. What do you imagine that people, as they read it right now, today, I hope this afternoon, in what ways does it echo? In what ways is this a book, as all books are, a product of its moment, and what moment, perhaps?
Yeah. Well, historians very much are shaped by the questions of the questions they ask as human beings are questions of the moment. or how they perceive of them from their kind of their frame of reference. And what really got me involved, I mean, I knew I wanted to write something about the questions about race in the revolution. That was where I began this, but I had no idea how to focus this, right? I had no idea what I was going to do until I started reading those newspapers, until I really they began to kind of shout out at me. And the idea of seeing them in the same thing over and over again, seeing Jane McCrae over and over and just sort of bombarding me with the same language, I began to think about what that might do. But I was doing this over the last 20 years and when I would talk about this book, people would say, oh, that's about Barack Obama. Oh, that's about war on terror. Oh, that's about remember John Ashcroft and his different color-coded terror alert things, and about, because it's a story about race and fear. And oh, it's about Tea Party. Oh, Donald Trump, birth certificates, and it's funny how it keeps coming up in all these things, right? Now, to my mind, I was really focused on those microfilm newspapers, but look at all that talk, and it still continues, right? We are still, it's so many moments. It also sort of reinforces just how important race and fear and politics and constitution, especially constitutional change, is. Those things all very much go together. It's part of one long sort of conversation, but it's also very contingent. It's choices people are making to talk about these things that I think is something we should be keeping in mind about what is it. We continue to reach into that toolbox and pick up those things. And that's something in American history is something we should really begin to think about.
So in those ways, your book turns out to be sort of a telescope for us to be able to see things that are both far away, right, and yet part of the larger universe in which we live.
That's a good way to put it.
Thank you so much, Rob. It was such a pleasure to be part of the National Archives program on the founding history of the United States, to have a chance to talk with you about this wonderful book, which is a pleasure to read and to think and to talk about. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.